What if $100,000 could control a $500,000 asset, while someone else's $100,000 goes directly into $100,000 of stock? On the surface, that sounds like real estate just wins. 5 times the asset, same starting cash. But here's the catch. If that property drops just 3%, the real estate investor doesn't feel a mild 3% loss. She feels a 15% hit to her original $100,000. Same math that made the upside look huge also makes the downside hit harder. So today, we're not asking which asset is better. We're asking what actually happens to the same $100,000 under both strategies, after leverage, cash flow, taxes, maintenance, liquidity, and opportunity cost get involved. We'll use $100,000 because it produces clean, easy-to-follow numbers. If you're working with $50,000, cut every dollar figure in half. The percentages hold exactly the same. 2 investors, $100,000 each. Investor A puts hers straight into a diversified stock portfolio. Investor B uses hers as a down payment and ends up controlling a $500,000 rental property, financed with a $400,000 mortgage. Let's build both models honestly, starting with the one that has more moving parts. 20% down on a $500,000 property is $100,000. That's Investor B's down payment, before closing costs, inspections, and cash reserves, which add more on top of that. For simplicity, we're treating the $100,000 as the investor's initial equity contribution and excluding closing costs and reserves from the base return calculation. In real life, those additional dollars would reduce the return on total cash invested. That means the real investor may need substantially more than $100,000 in available cash to execute this deal safely. We're using $100,000 as the initial equity contribution purely to keep the comparison clean. We're deliberately assuming a 20% down structure for the model. Actual investment property financing can require different down payments and terms. The remaining $400,000 gets financed. As of August 20, 2026, Freddie Mac's national survey put the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate at 6.65%. That's a real current number, but it's a general market benchmark, not a rate quoted specifically for investment properties, which can carry different pricing, underwriting requirements, and reserve rules than an owner-occupied loan. We're using 6.65% as our scenario assumption, not as a guaranteed rate for any individual investor. At 6.65% on a $400,000 loan, principal and interest come out to roughly $2,568 a month. That number is not the cost of owning this property, it's the cost of borrowing the money. Owning it costs more once you add property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. We'll get to those honestly in a minute because this is exactly where a lot of comparison videos quietly cut corners. For this model, let's assume the property generates $3,300 a month in gross rent. That's an illustration, not a national average. A $500,000 property can rent for very different amounts depending on the market, the property type, and local rent-to-price ratios. To see how much that assumption actually matters, here's the same property at 3 different rent levels. At $2,800 a month, the cash flow is weak or negative. At $3,300, it's borderline. At $3,800, it's meaningfully stronger. That's why a real estate return can depend heavily on the specific property and local market. We'll run the model at $3,300. That's $39,600 a year in gross rent. And gross rent is not profit. Before that money ever reaches the mortgage, it has to cover operating expenses, property taxes, insurance, routine maintenance, a vacancy allowance, and management if the owner isn't self-managing. What's left after those operating costs is net operating income, or NOI. Capital expenses, a new roof, a new HVAC system, get accounted for separately alongside financing. They're not part of NOI itself. Only after NOI do you subtract the mortgage payment to see what actually reaches the investor. Let's put numbers around it. For illustration, assume $1,100 a month goes to operating expenses, including taxes, insurance, maintenance, vacancy, and management. That leaves about $2,200 of NOI. The roughly $2,568 mortgage payment then puts the property at about $368 negative per month before income taxes and any additional capital expenditures. Actual expenses can vary dramatically by property and market. Skip that sequence and you'll either double count expenses or ignore them completely, which is how the tenant pays your mortgage turns into a myth. The tenant pays rent. The rent covers operating costs first. What survives that process is what goes toward the mortgage and the investor's actual return. Say this $500,000 property appreciates 3% in a year, $15,000. Unremarkable, measured against the full value of the property. But investor B didn't put in $500,000, she put in $100,000. Measured against her actual cash, that $15,000 increase is 15% of her original $100,000 equity I. Before considering financing costs, operating expenses, transaction costs, or taxes. That's leverage. A modest appreciation number on the property becomes a striking return on the investor's own money. And it runs in both directions, which is the part usually left out. Drop that same property 3%, and it's still $15,000. A 15% hit to her $100,000 of equity. Leverage doesn't create returns. It magnifies whatever the underlying asset does to your equity, up or down. Investor A isn't borrowing anything. No loan to service, no tenant, no roof. Using an illustrative planning assumption of 8% annual growth, an assumption, not a promise, $100,000 compounding for 20 years grows to roughly $466,000 before taxes and fees. That's the original capital compounding on itself, plus reinvested gains and dividends, with no borrowed money required to get there. It's worth being precise about that 8% figure. As of July 31st, 2026, the S&P 500's trailing 10-year annualized return was 13.17%. And that figure specifically measures price return, which excludes dividends. That's a real recent number, and it is not a forecast for the next 20 years. Different measurement windows produce very different answers, which is exactly why an 8% assumption is a planning number, not a historical guarantee. And why treating any single percentage as what the market returns is one of the most common mistakes in this debate. The property, at a conservative 3% annual appreciation assumption, grows from $500,000 to roughly $903,000 over 20 years. That number by itself tells you almost nothing about the investor's actual outcome. Here's what does. After 20 years of payments on that original $400,000 loan, the remaining mortgage balance is roughly $224,600. Subtract that from the $903,000 property value, and investor B is looking at somewhere around $678,000 of equity before selling costs, which typically run several percent of the sale price, and before whatever the property's cash flow did along the way. But that isn't the investor's final check. Selling costs would come out first, and taxes may apply depending on the investor's situation. And remember, $678,000 is property equity, not a calculated investment return. A true return comparison would also account for closing costs, additional cash contributions, repairs, taxes, and selling costs. That's a far more honest number than just saying the property becomes $903,000. Appreciation only tells part of the story. Every mortgage payment also reduces the loan balance over time. The principal portion of those mortgage payments reduces the loan balance and increases the investor's equity, while the interest portion is a financing cost. Rent may help fund those payments, but whether it actually covers them depends on the deal, because every one of those advantages comes with an obligation attached. Interest doesn't pause when the market's slow. Maintenance doesn't wait for a convenient month. A vacancy or a bad tenant can turn a profitable year into a break-even one. And Investor B's wealth is now concentrated in one building, one neighborhood, one local economy, a very different kind of risk than owning a diversified index of hundreds of companies. Rental property does carry one genuine tax advantage. The IRS allows residential rental property to be depreciated over a 27.5-year recovery period, creating a deduction that can meaningfully reduce taxable rental income without any cash actually leaving the investor's pocket that year. That's real. The benefit can also be limited by passive activity and at-risk rules depending on the investor's situation. The tax benefit isn't simply free money. Depreciation reduces your basis, which can increase the taxable gain when you sell. Separately, and people frequently mix these two up, if you sell a home that qualifies as your primary residence, generally one you've owned and lived in for at least 2 of the past 5 years, you can potentially exclude up to $250,000 of gain if you're single, or $500,000 for many married couples filing jointly. That's a primary residence rule. It doesn't automatically extend to a rental property you never lived in. If investor A needs $20,000, she can sell roughly $20,000 of stock, and for most U.S. stock trades, settlement is generally the next business day. Investor B can't sell 4% of a house. Her real options are a refinance, a home equity line of credit, or selling the whole property, each involving time, paperwork, and cost. Stocks generally offer much more liquidity and flexibility. Real estate generally offers leverage and direct control. Neither is a flaw, they're different tools. That distinction also explains something people get backwards about volatility. Stocks feel riskier because you watch the price move every second. Real estate feels calmer because it doesn't get a daily quote. But a lack of visible pricing isn't a lack of risk. According to the FHFA House Price Index, U.S. house prices rose just 1.7% year over year in the first quarter of 2026, and 8 states, plus Washington, D.C., actually recorded declines. Real estate can lose value. You just don't get a ticker telling you when it happens. Investor B can improve the asset directly, Renovate, adjust rents where the market supports it, tighten expenses, refinance when conditions improve, choose her tenants. Investor A cannot call a company in her index fund and ask them to run more efficiently this quarter. Direct ownership gives a level of control stock ownership never will, even though broader market forces still shape the outcome either way. And in return, easy to manage doesn't mean easy to hold. A diversified portfolio needs almost no operational effort, but it demands psychological discipline. Every investor eventually lives through a crash or a tempting headline, and the 8% assumption only plays out if she actually stays invested through the uncomfortable years. The same honesty applies to real estate's passive income reputation. A well-managed rental with a good property manager can become close to passive, but it isn't passive by default. Someone answers the call when the water heater fails, and that time has real economic value even when it never shows up on a spreadsheet. Here's the question that decides this whole debate. What happens to the leftover money each month? Say Investor B's rental runs $400 a month negative after every expense and the mortgage, realistic in a higher rate environment. Now let's make the comparison fair again. If Investor B has to put another $400 a month into the rental, suppose Investor A invests that same $400 a month into stocks. That contribution alone, compounding at 8% for 20 years, grows to roughly $235,000. Add that to her original $100,000 growing to $466,000, and Investor A's total comes to somewhere around $701,000 before taxes and fees. This isn't the same base case anymore. Suppose Investor B instead finds a materially better rental deal that produces an average $400 a month of cash flow after operating expenses and the mortgage, and the investor reinvests that money into stocks. She builds that same roughly $235,000 stock position on top of her real estate equity. Suddenly, Investor B isn't holding one asset. She's holding property equity around $678,000 plus a stock position around $235,000, a combined total that can rival or exceed Investor A's outcome entirely. That reveals something the stocks versus real estate framing hides. There's a third strategy this debate often leaves out, not stocks alone, not real estate alone. Real estate plus reinvesting its cash flow into stocks, capturing leverage and liquidity at the same time. That's usually the honest answer to, why can't I just do both? And it's a stronger strategy than either pure version, provided the investor actually has the cash and discipline to run it. Run this under different, equally realistic conditions, and you get different answers. High financing costs, weak rent, expensive repairs, and a stock investor who consistently reinvests. Stocks pull ahead, often by a wide margin. A well-bought property, rent that comfortably covers expenses, low vacancy, and a long hold, real estate can substantially outperform. And under moderate, middle-of-the-road assumptions with disciplined reinvestment on either side, the gap is often much smaller than either side of this argument online wants you to believe. So, $100,000, stocks or real estate? Stocks generally offer greater liquidity, easier diversification, and a lower operational burden. Real estate generally offers leverage and direct control over the asset. Neither one automatically wins on total return. That outcome depends on the purchase price, the financing, the rent, the appreciation, the expenses, the taxes, how long you hold, how disciplined you are, and more than any single one of those, what you actually do with the leftover cash flow every month. The investor who ends up wealthier isn't necessarily the one who picked the theoretically better asset. It's the one who understood what her money was doing after the purchase, the leverage she took on, the liquidity she gave up, and whether she let the leftover cash sit idle or put it back to work. Liquidity versus leverage, compounding versus control. The bigger risk is choosing an investment without understanding the leverage, costs, obligations, and cash flow attached to it. If you had $100,000 today and had to choose a diversified stock portfolio, the down payment on a rental property, or the rental plus reinvesting its cash flow into stocks, which one would you actually pick, and what assumption would change your answer? Drop it in the comments. I want to see where people land.